Greetings, and thank you for joining us for another SANS ICS concept overview. I'm Don C. Weber of Cutaway Security and a certified SANS instructor. In this concept overview, we are joined by Dan Gerard, the Chief Technology Officer for the Association of Illinois Electric Cooperatives. Dan joins us to discuss the RC3 Self Assessment risk analysis process. We talk about what the RC3 process is and how electrical cooperatives are using it when following the Cybersecurity Maturity Model, C2M2, is too complex for their needs and their team's availability. If you enjoy this video and the topics we cover in the SANS ICS concept overviews, be sure to like and subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment if you have a question about this topic or suggestions for future content. Okay, welcome back to another SANS ICS concepts video. This time I'm joined by Dan Gerard. I'm saying that correctly, right? Gerard?
Correct, yep.
Excellent. So I recently went to a cooperative conference. It was put on by the NRECA. I gave a talk out there about security assessments. And while I was doing that, while I was networking as we do at security conferences, I met Dan and I got to talk to Dan. And he introduced me to kind of the way that they do security assessments in co-ops, which I had no idea. And one of the processes, one of the tools that they use is the RC3 Self Assessment. So as soon as I found that out, of course, I wanted to know more about it. And I asked Dan here, he agreed to come talk to us. So Dan, do me a favor, introduce yourself and then just kind of go into the, whatever you want to talk about the self-assessment.
Sure, absolutely. Again, my name is Dan Gerard. I serve as the Chief Technology Officer here at the Association of Illinois Electric Cooperatives. So essentially, we're the statewide organization that all Illinois electric cooperatives belong to. Been here about 9 years. Really enjoy it. Came out of the healthcare industry of 14 years. Formerly served as the CISO for a large health organization in Illinois. But been here 9 years, love it. It's been a phenomenal place to work, and the people are even better to work with. So yeah, we do a lot of different things here at the statewide. The one thing I want to really emphasize is we're not a regulatory or governing entity over our membership in any way, shape, or form. So we're simply a value-based, value-added type organization that provides, again, value services to our membership. And we do a lot of different services: legal government relations, safety training, regulatory compliance, assessments. And recently, just maybe in the past, 6 or 7 years, really started offering some cybersecurity type services to our membership. Now,
so, Dan, just to help, partially to help me understand, but to also help the viewership that might not be experienced with electrical co-ops. Can you help us understand what an electrical co-op is? And is it different is the Illinois co-op different than what we might see in other states or other locations?
Yeah, so we have a wonderful saying in the co-op space that goes something like this: if you've seen one co-op, you've seen one co-op. They're all exactly different. And we actually serve 3 different types of co-ops here in Illinois. We have generation and transmission. So think power plant, right? That's where your electricity is generated at or purchased from the market, MISO market. And then we have distribution cooperatives. And so when you think distribution cooperatives, that's typically who you pay your electric bill to, right? They step down that high voltage and bring it down to that 110, 120 to your house. And then in Illinois, we also have 4, I believe, they're telephone cooperatives. So not from the traditional sense, think more ISP, right? So landlines have kind of gone by the wayside. They're providing more VoIP type services and broadband service.
Broadband, okay.
So that's kind of the demographics of our membership.
Oh, excellent, thank you.
So, and then we all roll into a national organization. Don, you mentioned it earlier, NRECA. That is our national organization. NRECA is made up of roughly 900 members across the United States. And they provide a lot of different services to their membership as well. And when I say their membership, those GNTs that we discussed, the distribution cooperatives, the telephone cooperatives, and the statewide across the U.S. all belong to this national organization, NRECA. And so they provide a lot of services from the federal level, if that makes sense.
Excellent. Awesome. So you're going to talk about the, the primary reason why we're here to talk about is self-assessments. And my understanding is it's the way the RC3 self-assessment is a way to do a risk assessment within an organization associated with cybersecurity, digital security, however you want to put it. Cybersecurity seems to be the trend these days. So I would assume that the RC3 is a cybersecurity risk assessment and not necessarily a vulnerability assessment. So can you talk about that? And then certainly we can show people some resources.
Sure. I do want to back up a little bit. So
okay.
When I came on board here 9 years ago, the RC3 self-assessment didn't exist. And so as I reached out and looked for different resources and what people were utilizing to do assessments and kind of look at their cybersecurity posture, our national organization was really pointing membership to the C2M2 model, which was a Department of Energy assessment model. And when I started asking around, a lot of our guys were familiar with it. A lot of our members had even utilized it. But a lot of the feedback I got was, it's overwhelming. There's so many questions. I don't understand all of this stuff. Or I would hear things like, "That's great, Dan. I filled it out, filed it in a drawer, and no one ever looked at it or saw it again," right? The IT professional or whoever just filled it out and filed it. And so fast forward a couple of years after I started, and the RC3 program at our national organization was born. And that was primarily funded through the DOE, some grant funds that were made available. And the first thing that they kind of came out of the gate with, and I thought was great, was the self-assessment tool. And essentially what they had done was they started with the C2M2 model, and they said, okay, if we really want people to adopt this, we have to almost water it down a little bit.
I'm sorry.
No. They basically, what we had done was we looked at it and said, okay, if we're really going to get people to adopt this, we have to bring it down to their level, because the C2M2 model had just, if you've ever looked at that spreadsheet, it's 3 or 4 times the amount of data that the RC3 self-assessment has within it. And so it was really to lower the bar, lower the barrier of entry into being effective and efficient with your risk assessments. And so, in my opinion, the RC3 self-assessment is probably one of the best things that came out of the RC3 program. And really, if you know anything about the C2M2 model, it was all based off of NIST. And so as you look through the program, the RC3 self-assessment program, you can see it's very evident that it aligns very closely with NIST. In fact, we can look at those, Dawn, right now. The 4 or 5 different topics that are really addressed in the self-assessment are identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, right? We should, as security professionals, we should all be very familiar with those terms.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so it really focuses in on each one of those without kind of getting out of hand, so to speak.
So is this what you're talking about here, the spreadsheet, or did you want one of the other documents?
Yeah, if let's see, go to the maturities tab there, Dawn.
Okay.
And then you can see across the top. Now, this is a metric sheet that we're looking at here, and obviously we don't have any data plugged into the program. But as you would, fill this out, you would start to see those metrics populate on this slide here.
Right, and that's it. So what I've highlighted are what you're talking about, the NIST cybersecurity frameworks: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. All of the functions that are covered within the cybersecurity framework are identified here. So if I'm hearing what you're saying is that once you started filling out, started doing your assessments, asking the questions, certainly possibly using is it the framework provided as a guide, or one of the other documents, the Word documents and stuff like that, have the questions, the specific questions to ask directed towards electrical co-ops? Would that be accurate?
That's correct. Yeah. So what we do here is we basically use a template Word document that has all of the questions attached. I want to say it's somewhere roughly around 150 questions.
Okay.
The one thing I like about this assessment particularly is you'll see that there's a lot of questions on identify. And
okay.
I mean, I can't stress how important that is. If you haven't heard it before, for our audience, you can't protect what you don't know about.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one of the primary reasons I think that NRECA and the DOE focus so much in on the identify piece of this, is because you can't protect what you don't know about. It's just as simple as that. So digging in and asking those tough questions on, where's your device inventory? How often is it updated? A lot of those kind of questions are what we're going to find in the identify section of the assessment.
Okay, so you go through and you sit down with the team. I think that's actually one of the more interesting things that I experienced or learned about while I was at the conference with y'all, is that the co-ops, while larger utilities will have a large team, a large risk assessment team, especially if they're associated with NERC, they'll have a large team for risk assessments. Of course, they're bringing in stakeholders from different areas. But when you're talking about the teams, the IT teams, the information security teams at co-ops, it might be a single person. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, that's extremely accurate, Don. I mean, you have to remember we're small rural electric utilities, so it's not uncommon to find utilities with only 15 to under 100 employees. So you can imagine it's really hard to justify a full-on IT staff or even a dedicated cybersecurity professional for that matter. It just doesn't exist. So a singular IT guy is typically what we find. And kind of going back to the C2M2 model, I think that's partially why it was ineffective, is because a lot of people were trying to just a lot of people were trying to do this on their own without a facilitator. And I think you miss out on so much because, like I mentioned earlier, with that C2M2, the IT guys would fill it out and file it away. No one else ever looked at it, right? That might get pulled out once every year, every other year. And so one of the first requirements that I laid out as I started to administer these and facilitate these assessment was, I want all of your senior staff to be invited. In fact, I required them to be present. And that can be pretty difficult because, your CFO, your operations guy, the cybersecurity is probably the last thing on their mind. And so that's been a struggle. But what I found is almost every single assessment I've done, I've had those CFOs, the operations guys come up to me afterwards and say, I had no idea how much our IT guy was responsible for.
Wow.
Right?
Yes.
And I took it one step further, and I would actually send the senior staff the assessment, right, the questionnaire ahead of time. And I would ask them to go ahead and fill it out from their perspective, right? I want you to fill this out. I don't want you to talk to any of your peers. I don't want you to look at policies, procedures. I definitely don't want you to talk to the IT guy. I want you to fill this out as you perceive it to be, so that when we get around and we talk together in that table, we can very, very clearly see that there's a different perception of the cybersecurity posture from each person.
Identifying those systemic gaps that aren't readily apparent. You get a spreadsheet, you're like, okay, yeah, they know what they're doing. You know, they know our assets, or they've got an approach to this. You just assume that because of the information that's in there, but not necessarily what was your initial thought around that. What those differences are, because those are the systemic differences between leadership, management, and actually what's being accomplished on the ground with the resources they have.
Yeah, yeah, and it seemed to be effective, because we would go around, and inevitably I would always say, we're going to let the IT person answer last, right? I want every person to go around, including the CEO, and let's all hear what you answered for each question. And then we'll let the IT guy answer last, and then let's collectively discuss each one of these, and let's all land on the same answer. So we're all on the same page. So we've all come to an agreement on where we're at with this particular control question, whatever it may be.
Yeah, and that was my doing this, and not in the so I did this in the IT side. I didn't do this on the OT side, but my experience was sitting down and using the cybersecurity framework, not necessarily this, but so we had to kind of make it up on our own around as the information gathering, what we had, and so forth. But we did have to honestly grade ourselves, and then keep each other honest. And at least sitting around a table and doing this, we sat around a table to actually do that. But we all knew we started the conversation with, hey, everybody have thick skin. We're going to point things out. This is designed to identify gaps. Whether you agree to it or not, somebody's going to bring up a gap, and then we'll have an actual discussion around it. It's not attacking or anything like that. Fortunately, I had a team of leaders at that company that understood that and did put on their thick skin, and didn't get offended when somebody said, really, are you doing that really well? I think you've had problems, and they point out specific problems around what we did. So I do think that it's valuable to have those conversations, but we have to be adults, right? Everybody has to be adult. It's not personal. This is just trying to help everybody understand where we're actually at within the organization.
Yeah, ideally, you've already started to build a positive cybersecurity culture, because that's the biggest fear, right? I mean, anytime we talk about pen tests and the IT professionals, there's a weird dichotomy there, right? That sometimes the IT team or singular professional, whatever the scenario might be, they may feel attacked, that you're bringing in a third party to do an assessment. You have to break that down. You have to be willing, like you said, to have thick skin, have those tough conversations. And, I think pulling in senior staff is also just another way that I can communicate to our membership that, hey, right, we've heard it 100 times over, cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility. If that's true, you need to have a seat at the table and be a part of these discussions. One, that just gives your IT team or your IT person or your cybersecurity person the support that they need to know that, hey, these guys have my back. We're trying to figure this out together. It has to be approached that way.
Awesome. So, I mean, you brought up pen testing and so forth. So, and I've been I'm doing a lot of training in ISA IEC 62443 and their risk assessment process, as part of their program management. So where in my mind, this kind of falls into when you're talking about this, this risk assessment part, this in my mind would be more of a detailed high level risk assessment or gap assessment, as they call it, which is just gathering information about the process, identifying all of the things that are there, identifying where we want to be, and understanding it from an overview perspective, but not necessarily doing that vulnerability assessment, whether it's passive or active. and to gather that information. So that's what it's sounding like to me. So as a part of RC3, is there an active vulnerability assessment portion of this, or is that like a follow-on step?
Yeah, so there's no active vulnerability assessment. Now, with that said, I've kind of tweaked the RC3 myself. And so when I go and facilitate this, I actually bring in three different pieces. I bring in the self-assessment tool that we've been discussing here. I also bring in a open source vulnerability scanner virtual machine that I can plop in on site and leave with our member so that they do get that vulnerability scanning aspect of it, kind of that just constant scanning. And I like to preface the self-assessment with a tabletop exercise. So we'll do a short, like, couple hour tabletop exercises with all the senior staff present before we even get into the self-assessment, because it starts to get the wheels turning, right? We throw a scenario out there, we start talking about all these things, and it really helps drive more productivity into that self-assessment tool.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the documents that you showed me. I've kind of called it up, but I believe this is your kind of blank slate tabletop tool that you're using as part of the tabletops.
Correct. Yes.
Awesome. Yeah. So this is there's a good thing. So here's a probably not, I mean, don't want to give too much away about your scenario and stuff like that, but here's a brief introduction, the actual tabletop scenario, which takes about an hour, and then followed with the lessons learned. So within 2 hours of sitting down, having all of your people in one location for 2 hours, which can be a big deal in some organizations, but certainly you can get so much information around people's expectations, the actual implementation, who they think's in charge, especially from that incident response standpoint, who's in charge, who's responsible for what resources do they have, and so forth. Is that kind of what this is intended to draw out?
Exactly. Yeah. And I played around with doing the tabletop exercise before and after the self-assessment. And I found that it just flops if you do it after. Everyone is so burnt out from the discussions with 150 questions and all the discussions that revolve around that. They're just so done. They don't want to talk about
cybersecurity anymore.
Yeah, they're done. But what I did find is if I run this ahead of the self-assessment, that it really plays well into it.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I would think that using it to follow up and to demonstrate the improvements, but I mean, it makes more sense. Let's show you that you have misconceptions.
You don't know what you don't know, right?
Right. Okay. And then let's gather that information so that so that the stakeholders are more invested in actually having accurate information in their risk assessment or their self-assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. Because inevitably, when you run that tabletop exercise first, those stakeholders, those senior staff that aren't plugged into the cybersecurity world, they have so many questions to ask. And so, it just really gets the wheels turning.
Excellent.
And again, you have to remember, we're talking small utilities here, right? We don't have large cybersecurity teams. It's typically one guy, one man band.
Yeah, and I know you tried to get, and I appreciate you asking and trying to get somebody to come in that's been through it from an implementation standpoint. Usually, and we kind of did it on short notice, but at the same time, it's always difficult to get people to talk about their process and what they work on day to day, as well as not having necessarily the time to get away since they're one person shop or two people shop. But can you provide a description of how this might have helped or success that you've seen, and, success through challenges or anything like that around the implementation of this improvement of cybersecurity?
Yeah, and I would also say, as cooperatives, we're positioned in such a way that we can really, I think, take more advantage of this. And the reason why I say that is, one of our core principles is cooperation among cooperatives. So oftentimes when I go and I facilitate one of these assessments, I'll invite IT professionals from surrounding cooperatives. And so they get to come in and give input into the discussions and also learn a little bit about that particular cooperative's environment. And so we get a lot of, oh, well, how do you do it? Oh, you do it that way? Well, that didn't work for me, or that does work for me, right? And so there's a lot of learning that not only takes place at the cooperative that we're facilitating it at, but they take that information back to their cooperatives and share it and implement things. So yeah, one assessment could benefit, multiple cooperatives.
And that's actually what I was hoping for. Like, part of my talk was to share those security assessments, especially for these smaller things. While sharing this information, it's difficult. I mean, it's difficult to share your asset list and all your agreements and stuff like that. In your network diagrams, your architecture diagrams, and so forth, can't really be doing that. But sharing the experiences, especially from an obfuscated standpoint, that was one of my goals, was to talk to and encourage people to figure out a way to share those security assessments, the actual active security assessments, to help people understand the implementation gaps that people don't realize. We implement these security controls all the time. We, access controls, network configurations. But what didn't we consider when we were implementing some vendors' product? So we didn't realize that they told us to configure it this one way for this specific reason. We decided not to, and unknowingly introduce a gap. So I'm hoping that people will start sharing some of those security assessments, at least some of the knowledge around that. That's why we have user groups and so forth. I assume that's why you guys have the co-op, the national organization that helps you with that, sharing some of that information. So
Yeah.
Awesome. Is there, so Dan, is there anything that we've missed talking about the RC3 self-assessment process?
I think, the one thing I'd like to mention is it's still fairly new,
Okay.
but our adoption rate has been excellent. I was talking with Cynthia Sue, who's now working with the Department of Energy, but she was our former. She basically headed up the RC3 program at the NRECA.
That's right.
And last time I was talking with her, I think it was at the conference we attended. She was saying that was the most successful program that they had rolled out there at NRECA. So, again, I also want to emphasize that this is great. If you're not doing something like this, this is a great starting point, but it's just that, right? It's a starting point. It's a stepping stone. And it's not a one and done type deal, right? We should be doing this annually or every other year at a bare minimum. And then once you get into those higher maturity levels, which we didn't even talk about that, Dawn, part of the assessment is breaking things down into different maturity levels. We have maturity indicator level 1 through 3. So basically think of it as beginner, intermediate, and advanced. And so, hopefully you're knocking out those maturity indicator level 1s, the basic rudiments, the first year. I would hope everyone is. And then as you progress over the next, 2, 3, 4 years, you should be getting better scores on the higher maturity indicator levels. Once you've maxed that out, now maybe it's time to move on to something a little bit more complex, like the C2M2 assessment. But at the end of the day, it's all the same, right? And we're looking at, what is risk? Risk is likelihood times impact, right? And so a lot of times I think when, especially senior staff, when they hear risk assessment, they hear this big daunting task that has to be done. And it's really not that difficult, right? Mm-hmm. Let's look at the things that are challenging to us or perceived threats or real threats. And then let's just say, okay, how are we going to handle it? What's the impact and likelihood? And then we can score accordingly.
Right, and that's what I like about the C2M2 and this program and so forth. Taking that strong NIST cybersecurity framework, and helping, and these types of programs are helping people adapt that to their actual implementation. I mean, we see these types of things. I mean, the C2M2 is there's utilities, there's gas and oil, there's natural gas. There's every sector has their own version of it because they have their own types of challenges and technologies and thought processes and so forth. So it makes sense to have some sector-specific versions of these, and for everybody to get behind. And the fact that this, to me, is that version for that scaled down version, kind of integration of the cybersecurity framework and the C2M2 that's applicable within co-op environments. I think it's important, and I'm glad to see that it got such wide distribution. Listen to Cynthia's talk. It seems like a lot of utilities are actually using this to improve their programs. So that was really good to hear.
Yeah, you're absolutely right there. We do have to, I think, treat the verticals a little bit differently. I recently served on the Illinois Cybersecurity Commission. We worked together to, put together a statewide cybersecurity plan. And so in my working groups, we had a lot of different verticals. And a good example is, I'll just go back to healthcare. Anytime we talk about cyber, we're talking about, the CIA triangle, right? The confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the data. I don't care what vertical you're in, the data is going to be protected. We're protecting one of those three things. However, it's different per vertical, right? And think healthcare, confidentiality is going to be extremely important, right? And so how I protect confidentiality may be different than the electric world, where I'm probably a little bit more concerned with the availability of the system and the integrity of the system. When we think about the Ukraine attacks, that happened back 2015, 2016. A lot of people don't realize that even today they are still struggling with being able to trust the integrity of their system. So in a lot of ways, they're operating in a very manual mode still. They haven't reintroduced a lot of those systems that created safety, efficiency, all those other things. So it is different, right? In generally, we're always trying to protect the confidentiality, available integrity, but depending on the vertical, those may be weighted a little bit differently.
Oh yeah, I mean, well, it's like any other compensating control, and we're getting to an area where I harp on a lot. I'm glad you said CIA, just because you did put it in that order, and I'm glad you did, because in my mind, my viewpoint is that we have to ask about each one of those. We can't ignore any one of those three if we're doing this correctly. Now, when we're selecting compensating controls and updating our processes and so forth, we might emphasize one of those over the other, but we have to consider them all. So, but it's we absolutely do. And so this actually helps people, I think, going through this, that whole maturity model, where we want to be. I think it's important to remind everybody that we always don't want to be. You use the a beginner, intermediate, and expert, I think you said. We don't need to be expert in everything, right? We need to understand what we have out there, understand the actual threats to our environments, and then decide which level we want to be, and then identify those gaps. That's what this whole process does, is it helps us identify those gaps and move that area towards the maturity that we want it to be, whether it's intermediate. If we're low, we want to be intermediate, and we should do that. But if we try to be expert in everything, we're going to over-engineer. We're going to be emphasizing confidentiality when we should be focusing on integrity, those types of things. But we still always need to ask all of these questions. If we're not asking these questions, we don't have the knowledge that we need to make the proper decisions, in my mind. And I think that that's what this process is getting. Dan, I really appreciate you breaking this down, introducing us to co-ops, small electrical utilities, introducing us to how they're managed, their and so forth, and how they're improving their cybersecurity posture through this RC3 Self Assessment. Thank you very much for joining us. First of all, how can people get a hold of you if they want to get a hold of you? Is there anything that you want to point them to as far as what's going on?
Yeah, I would say feel free to drop me a line. Send me an email. It's Gerard, that's GERARD at AIEC.coop, COOP.
We'll make sure it's in the show notes.
Yeah, throw it in there, and feel free to drop me a line. Always a pleasure to talk to other colleagues and people in the industry. The one thing I would like to bring up, we do have a conference that we host for small utilities, electric utilities. That'll be coming up in October, October 26th through the 27th. There we go, in O'Fallon, Illinois. We usually run 2 tracks on that. We have an IT track, which is going to be obviously anything IT, technology, and cybersecurity. And we also run an engineering track. So full day pre-conference training workshop, and then the standard, trade show breakout sessions for the next day and a half after that. So
wow, that sounds really exciting. So I'll have to check my dates on that. It sounds really exciting. Hey, Dan, I really appreciate you taking the time to come to speak to us about this, and say, you're really passionate about it, and I appreciate that. Other than that, have a great weekend, and I'm sure we'll be talking soon.
Sounds good. It's been a pleasure, Don.
All right. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for tuning in to another concept overview with the SANS ICS and Cutaway security teams. Please let us know if there are other topics you would like us to cover in the comments below. If you enjoyed the content, please be sure to like and subscribe to the SANS ICS YouTube channel. This has been Don C. Weber of Cutaway Security. Go forth and do good things.